You clicked on this because you suspect something is different about how elite performers work. And you're right, but not in the way you think. The difference isn't that they work harder. It's not that they have better genes or more time. And it's not that they discovered some secret technique you haven't found yet. The real difference is almost invisible, because it contradicts everything you've been told about how to stay motivated. Here it is. Elite performers spend the vast majority of their time doing the exact same thing over and over, not because they have to, but because they've learned something that most people never discover. They've learned that repetition, the thing that makes everyone else feel stuck and bored, is actually the fast lane to mastery. Think about the people who excel in their field. A world-class violinist plays the same etudes hundreds of times. A top surgeon performs variations of the same procedure thousands of times. The elite trader executes the same decision framework repeatedly. An Olympic sprinter runs the same distance the same way thousands of times. Most people assume they do this until they're good enough to move on to something more interesting. That assumption is wrong. Here's what actually happens. They never move on. They go deeper. Most of us are trained from childhood that boredom is a signal. When you feel bored, your instinct is to leave. Find something new. Chase novelty. Pick a different hobby, a different project, a different skill. This makes sense in casual life. But in domains where people become truly exceptional, boredom operates like a hidden thermometer. It measures something important. And people who pay attention to what it's measuring discover the pattern. The pattern is this. Boredom is where mastery begins. But you probably don't feel that way. Most people feel the opposite. When you practice the same skill repeatedly, your motivation crashes. Your attention wanders. You start scrolling for something more interesting. The repetition feels pointless, so you switch. You try something new. You convince yourself that breadth is better than depth, because depth feels like stagnation. Here's the part most people miss entirely. What you're experiencing is not boredom. It's the early stage of compression. Your brain is still looking for stimulation in novelty because it hasn't yet learned to find novelty within refinement. There is a framework that explains why elite performers see repetition differently, and it changes everything about how you think about progress. The framework has two parts. First, understand what you're actually doing when you repeat something. You're not just doing the same thing. You're creating conditions for your nervous system to compress learning. Every repetition is an opportunity to notice something you missed before, a micro variation in technique, a pattern in how the system responds, a subtle inefficiency, an edge you can refine. Second, understand why most people miss this. Your attention is too high level. You're thinking, I'm playing scales again, instead of, today I'm going to notice how my finger pressure changes the tone in the third octave. You're thinking, another sales call, instead of, today I'm testing whether my opening question should be open or specific. The elite performers aren't doing something different. They've trained their attention to see infinite complexity within what everyone else dismisses as repetition. This is why calling it boredom is actually a mistake. What you're experiencing when you want to leave repetition is not boredom. It's insufficient attention architecture. Your brain is searching for newness because you haven't built the mental machinery to find newness in refinement. When elite performers repeat something, they're not white-knuckling through motivation. They're satisfying a different kind of curiosity. They've learned to ask micro-questions, better questions, questions that turn apparent repetition into active exploration. The depth they're discovering is real. It's not in their head. In music, tone quality changes imperceptibly with each micro-adjustment. In athletics, performance shifts fractionally with each technical refinement. In decision-making, each iteration reveals a new variable you hadn't considered. In writing, each revision uncovers a layer you didn't see before. Most people see repetition and feel like they're wasting time. Elite performers see the same repetition and feel like they're mining for gold. The difference isn't their threshold for boredom. It's their ability to compress attention, to find an infinite frontier within an apparently finite space. This is where the curiosity loop opens. If repetition is actually the fast lane to mastery, why doesn't everyone just embrace it? Why do so many smart, driven people keep jumping to the next thing? The answer involves something about how your brain is wired and how elite performers have learned to rewire it. That's what we're exploring next. Here's something you've probably noticed but never named. Successful people in completely different fields describe the same experience. A chess grandmaster talks about seeing deeper into positions. A novelist talks about finding what the story is really about in the fifth rewrite. A software engineer talks about discovering elegant solutions that only appear after months of working the same problem from different angles. A basketball player talks about the game slowing down after thousands of hours of the same drills. They're not describing luck. They're describing a specific phenomenon that happens when you stay in one domain long enough. And almost nobody is prepared for what that phenomenon actually is. Most people assume mastery is about accumulation, collecting more techniques, more knowledge, more options. So when they plateau, they assume the solution is to add something new, learn another skill, try a different approach, branch out. This is the exact opposite of what elite performers do at the same inflection point. When elite performers hit a plateau, they go deeper into what they're already doing. They compress their attention further. They find new layers in the familiar. And here's what most people never discover. This is where exponential learning actually accelerates. Think about how learning normally works. When you start something new, the learning curve is steep. Every session teaches you something visible. You play tennis for the first time and immediately improve. You write your first article and learn obvious lessons. The novelty itself creates clarity. Your brain is flooded with new information, so you feel like you're making progress. But this learning is mostly low level. You're learning the vocabulary, the basic patterns, the surface rules. Then the curve flattens. Week 3, week 4 of practice. The improvements get smaller. The insights less obvious. Your brain has absorbed the basics. Now it's searching for something more subtle. This is where most people leave. They feel the plateau. They feel the boredom, and they think, I've learned what I can here. Time to move on. But they haven't learned what they can. They've only learned what's easy to learn. Elite performers recognize this moment differently. They recognize it as a shift, not an ending. The learning doesn't stop. It transforms. It moves from surface learning to compression learning, from acquiring new information to deepening understanding of existing information, from collecting to refining. This is where you discover that the domain you thought was simple is actually infinitely complex. The tennis serve isn't one move, it's thousands of micro-variations. The sales conversation isn't one script, it's a landscape of micro-decisions. The writing process isn't one first draft, it's layers of hidden structures you only see in revision. Most people chase novelty because they're still addicted to the early stage learning high, the feeling of visible progress, the excitement of, I didn't know this yesterday. But elite performers have moved past that. They've learned to find excitement in compression, in finding what was always there but invisible. Here's what changes when you see this pattern. You stop measuring success by how many new things you're learning and start measuring it by how many layers you're discovering in what you already know. You stop asking, what's the next skill? And start asking, what am I still missing in this one? This sounds abstract, but it shows up everywhere. In music, a beginner plays more pieces, an intermediate player learns more techniques. An elite performer plays the same piece so many times that each performance reveals something hidden about the composition itself. The piece doesn't change, their attention does. And attention is where all real progress lives. In business, most leaders rotate through different roles, thinking breadth creates capability. Elite leaders often deepen in one domain, becoming frighteningly good at that specific thing, because that's where exponential returns actually live. The surface looks the same. The depth is where all the money is. The principle underneath all of this is starting to emerge. And it's not what most motivation blogs tell you. It's not about willpower or passion or finding your purpose. It's about learning to compress your attention in ways that most people's brains have never been trained to do. There's a moment that repeats across almost every high-performance domain. It happens when someone realizes they've been measuring their own progress wrong the entire time. A surgeon I worked with described it this way. For the first 2 years, he counted procedures completed. More surgeries meant more experience. This is how doctors keep score. But around year 3, something shifted. He stopped counting procedures and started counting variations. How many different complications had he solved? How many micro-decisions had he refined? How many ways had he learned to see the same anatomy? His learning didn't speed up because he was seeing more patients. It accelerated because he changed what he was measuring. He was still in repetition. But his attention had shifted from breadth to depth, from accumulation to compression. Most people miss this entirely because it contradicts how we're taught to think about progress. You're supposed to expand, try new things, build a diverse skill set. This is good advice for generalists, but for people who want to reach the elite level in anything, it's backward. Have you noticed successful people operate by different rules about specialization? Not in the way people usually describe it. They don't talk about finding your niche or becoming an expert in one thing. That sounds limiting. What they actually do is more subtle. They pick something, they compress into it. They find that the deeper they go, the more valuable they become, not because they're repeating the same thing, but because they're discovering infinite complexity within it. A world-class copywriter doesn't write more ad copy than everyone else. She writes the same type nays of ad copy so many times that she's discovered patterns in human psychology that most copywriters never see. A world-class investor doesn't study more stocks than everyone else. He focuses on one sector so obsessively that he sees market movements that others miss. A world-class athlete doesn't do more sports. She does the same sport so many times that her nervous system is calibrated to perceive micro-variations that separate champions from everyone else. The pattern is identical across domains. Compression beats expansion, depth beats breadth, repetition beats novelty. But here's where it gets interesting. And this is the question that's going to pull you forward. Why does this work? What is actually happening in your brain and nervous system when you choose depth over novelty? Why do elite performers feel energized by repetition while most people feel drained by it? The answer involves psychology. It involves how your decision-making actually works. It involves a hidden framework that explains why your brain rebels against repetition and how elite performers trained theirs to do the opposite. That's what we're exploring next, because once you understand the mechanism, you can't unsee it, and you'll never approach repetition the same way again. Your brain is searching for novelty right now, even as you read this. It's a fundamental feature, not a bug. Your nervous system evolved to notice change, to scan for threats, to update its mental models when something new appears. This is why boredom feels so visceral. It's not weakness, it's your brain doing exactly what it's designed to do, trying to find newness. Most people never question this. They assume their brain is right. Boredom means leave, novelty means engagement. So they organize their entire life around this assumption. They job hop because the new role feels more stimulating than refinement in the old one. They switch hobbies because the old one feels stale. They chase trends because trends feel alive and mastery feels static. But elite performers have discovered something strange. They've discovered that boredom and novelty aren't opposites. And the brain's search for novelty doesn't require external change. It can be satisfied, intensely satisfied, by going deeper into what looks the same from the outside. This is where psychology becomes practical, because here's the mechanism. Your brain doesn't experience boredom when you're learning. Your brain experiences boredom when you're not learning. The mistake most people make is assuming that learning requires novelty, that you need new material to extract new insights, but that's not how neural compression actually works. When elite performers do the same thing repeatedly, they're not shutting off their learning, they're redirecting it. They're taking the novelty-seeking circuitry in their brain and pointing it at a different target. Instead of searching for new external information, they're searching for hidden internal patterns within what they already know. Think about the difference between these two scenarios. Scenario A, you play tennis. Week 1, you learn the basic forehand. Your brain floods with new information. Dopamine hits. Progress feels obvious. Week 2, the curve flattens. You still improve, but slowly. The novelty is gone. Your brain starts signaling, this is boring, find something new. Most people follow this signal. They try pickleball or paddle or badminton. New sport, new dopamine hit. Scenario B, you play tennis. Week 1, same as above. Week 2, the curve flattens. But instead of leaving, you change your question. You stop asking, what's the next shot? And start asking, what variations of this forehand can I discover? You film your strokes. You slow them down. You notice that your racket angle changes slightly depending on court position. You experiment with grip micro-adjustments. You discover that footwork variations create entirely different angles. In scenario B, your brain is still learning. You're still extracting novelty, but the novelty is compressed. It exists within the familiar structure. Your dopamine system doesn't know the difference. It just knows patterns being discovered, new information being extracted, learning is happening, engagement remains high. Elite performers have essentially learned to redirect their novelty-seeking circuitry inward. They've trained their attention to find infinite complexity within apparent simplicity. And this changes everything about how they experience repetition. But this doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen because they have different brains. It happens because they make a specific decision, and then they make it over and over until it becomes automatic. The decision is this. When you feel bored, you choose to compress your attention instead of expanding your environment. This sounds simple. It's not, because your brain's default is the opposite. When boredom appears, your instinct is to run, to find stimulation elsewhere, to jump to the next thing. The decision to stay requires overriding that instinct repeatedly. But here's what elite performers discovered. After you make this choice enough times, something shifts. Your brain learns. It starts finding novelty in compression naturally. The boredom doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes the signal that you're about to discover something new about what you thought you already understood. A professional musician described it this way. She said the first 1,000 times playing the same piece felt like torture. Her brain wanted to play something new, but she had committed to mastery, so she stayed. Somewhere around repetition 500, something changed. She stopped experiencing repetition as boring and started experiencing it as exploration. Each time through the piece, she discovered something hidden, a voice in the harmony she'd never heard, a rhythmic pattern that shifted meaning. An emotional layer she couldn't access until she'd played it that many times. By repetition 1,000, boredom had transformed into obsession. Not because the piece had changed, because her attention had deepened. She was no longer listening to the surface. She was listening into the structure. And that structure was infinitely complex. This is the psychological mechanism most people never discover, and it explains why elite performers don't just tolerate repetition, they crave it. Their brains have been trained to find novelty where others see only the same old thing. The question is, how do they train this? What's the actual framework that flips the switch? And once you understand it, can you use it? The framework that explains this is called the preparation paradox. And once you see it, you'll recognize it everywhere. Here's the principle. The more you prepare for a decision, the faster and more confident you become when that decision arrives. But there's a counterintuitive twist. The preparation doesn't come from studying new information. It comes from rehearsing the same decision framework over and over until it becomes invisible. Elite performers aren't learning something new each time they repeat. They're embedding something deeper. They're moving knowledge from conscious to unconscious, from deliberate to automatic. And this transition from "I have to think about this" to "this is just what I do" is where real capability lives. Think about how a surgeon operates. Watch one perform a routine procedure. It looks automatic, effortless, like she's not even thinking. Most people assume this is mastery, that she's so good she doesn't need to concentrate. But that's backward. She's so good because she's done it so many times that her conscious mind is freed up to notice what matters. During her first 100 procedures, she needed conscious attention on every step. Conscious attention is slow. It's resource-intensive. It leaves no bandwidth for noticing the subtle variations that distinguish a good outcome from an exceptional one. But after 1,000 procedures, the basic steps have moved to unconscious processing. This frees her conscious attention to focus on the micro-variations that only matter at elite levels. The color of tissue that signals something unusual, the texture of something that feels slightly wrong, the patient variation that requires adaptation. Most people see this and think she's learned so much, but that's not what happened. She learned the basics so thoroughly that she could forget about them and pay attention to everything else. This is the preparation paradox in action. Repetition doesn't bore her because repetition isn't what she's doing. She's using the repetition as a container for deeper learning. The surface looks the same. The depth expands infinitely. But assumption is wrong about what makes this work. Most people think, I'll practice until it's automatic, then I can move on to something harder. Elite performers think differently. They think, I'll compress this until it's automatic, then I can use that freed attention to discover everything I was too busy to notice before. These are opposite strategies. One is about escaping repetition. The other is about using repetition as a tool for deeper exploration. And here's where it gets important. Your brain responds differently to each strategy. When you're in escape mode, trying to get through repetition so you can move on, your nervous system is in a low-level state of frustration. You're fighting the boredom. Your dopamine is depressed. You're doing the minimum required. And because you're in this state, you're not actually seeing the domain deeply. You're filtering it through the lens of, how do I get out of here? When you're in compression mode, using repetition as a vehicle for discovery, your nervous system is in exploration. Your dopamine is activated by novelty seeking, but it's pointed inward. You're doing the same action, but with radically different attention. And in this state, you notice everything. The micro patterns, the hidden variations, the complexity that was always there but invisible. The interesting part is this. The difference isn't in the repetition, it's entirely in how you're directing your attention. Same action, different mental frame, completely different neural result. A trader I worked with described the moment this flipped for her. She was executing the same trading decision framework hundreds of times a day. Most traders found this mind-numbing. They wanted to learn new strategies. But she had made a commitment to mastery in this one framework, so instead of leaving, she changed her question. She started asking, what variations of this market condition am I missing? What micro-signals am I not noticing? Where is this framework failing? By month 6, she wasn't bored anymore. She was obsessed, not because trading had become more exciting, because she'd discovered that the domain she thought was simple was actually a landscape of hidden patterns. Each day revealed something new. Not new in the sense of new information, but new in the sense of something I wasn't skilled enough to perceive yesterday. This is the decision pattern that separates elite performers from everyone else. It's not about willpower, it's not about discipline, it's about learning to redirect your attention from "how do I escape this?" to "what am I not seeing yet?" But how do you actually make this shift? How do you train your brain to find novelty in compression instead of escaping into expansion? That's where the real framework emerges. And it's more practical than you think. Here's what most people do when they try to redirect their attention toward compression. They try too hard. They white-knuckle through boredom and convince themselves it will get better. They tell themselves, "I'm going to stay focused," and then they're still miserable because they're still fighting their brain's default programming. Willpower is the wrong tool here. Elite performers don't use willpower. They use something more sophisticated. They use a specific type of questioning that retrains what their attention is searching for. And the beautiful part is this. Once you know the questions, the shift happens almost automatically. The questions are deceptively simple, but they work because they're designed to hijack your brain's novelty-seeking circuitry and point it inward. Here's how it works in practice. Instead of thinking, "I'm bored with this," you ask, "What micro-variation did I miss last time?" Instead of thinking, "I need something new," you ask, "What layer of this am I still not seeing?" Instead of thinking, "When can I move on?" you ask, "What would mastery look like in this one domain?" These aren't motivational affirmations. They're attention redirectors. They're questions that force your brain to search the domain you're already in instead of searching for an exit. And your brain loves a genuine question. It will hunt for the answer even if the answer is subtle. A jazz pianist describes her practice this way. She practices the same standards hundreds of times. Most jazz musicians see this as necessary drudgery. You have to know the standards so you can improvise over them. But she reframed it entirely. She stopped seeing standards as material to memorize and started seeing them as laboratories for discovering variations in phrasing, tone, and timing. Each practice session, she chose one variable to explore. One day, how many different ways can I voice this chord progression? Another day, what happens if I play the melody slightly behind the beat? Another, how does my tone change if I think of this as a question instead of a statement? The standards didn't change, her questions did, and the questions created infinite novelty within the same material. Here's another example. A software engineer working on back-end systems faced the same problem. His team wanted to learn new frameworks, new languages, new technologies, but he'd made a decision to become frighteningly good at the system he was already maintaining. So he reframed his practice. He stopped thinking, "How do I keep this running?" and started thinking, "How many ways can I optimize this? Where are the inefficiencies? What would happen if I approach this problem from a completely different architectural angle?" Within months, he discovered patterns in the system that saved the company millions, not because he'd learned something new, because he'd learned to see what was always there, more deeply. The mechanism is this. Your brain's novelty-seeking circuitry doesn't care whether novelty comes from external sources or internal discovery. It just wants new patterns, new information, new things to understand. Elite performers figured out how to trick their brains, or more accurately, how to redirect their brains into seeking novelty in the deepest layers of what they already know. But there's another layer to this. And it's about something more fundamental than attention. Most people see repetition as static. You're doing the same thing over and over. Your environment isn't changing, so nothing new can happen. But elite performers see repetition as a series of experiments. Each repetition is a trial. Each trial reveals something. Each discovery is new information. This is a different relationship with time. Most people see repetition as going backward in time, revisiting the same thing. Elite performers see repetition as going sideways in time, exploring a different angle of the same thing. And this changes not just their motivation, but their entire nervous system response. When you're exploring, your brain is in growth mode. When you're repeating, your brain is in conservation mode. The activity is identical, the framing is opposite. And framing is where all the biology lives. This is why willpower doesn't work to fix boredom with repetition. Willpower is forcing yourself to stay in a place where your nervous system believes nothing new can happen. What works is reframing, changing what you believe repetition actually is, not doing the same thing, exploring a multidimensional domain that looks simple from the outside. Once you see this shift, the question becomes, how do you actually implement it? How do you take this framework and build it into your daily practice? Because understanding it intellectually is one thing, building it into your actual life is another. There's a moment in this journey where the psychology clicks into place. It happens when you realize that elite performers aren't actually different from you neurologically. They've just trained a specific skill that most people never develop. And the skill isn't about tolerance, it's about perception. The skill is this, learning to see mastery as infinite rather than finite. Most people approach any domain with an implicit endpoint. You learn tennis until you're decent, then you move on. You study leadership until you understand the basics. Then you apply it. You practice your craft until you're competent. Then you optimize. There's an imagined finish line, and once you cross it, further repetition feels pointless. Elite performers have a different operating system. They see every domain as infinitely deep. There is no finish line. There is no point at which further exploration becomes redundant. Every repetition is an expedition into an unmapped territory. This isn't optimism, it's pattern recognition. Because here's what they've discovered. In any sufficiently complex domain, the more you understand, the more you realize how much you don't understand. This creates a different relationship with repetition. Instead of repetition feeling like punishment, doing the same thing because you haven't graduated yet, it feels like privilege. You get another chance to explore something you're still discovering. A master chef describes cooking the same sauce hundreds of times not as practice, but as research. She's not trying to perfect it. She's trying to understand it. Temperature variations create invisible differences. Ingredient sourcing creates variations you can't predict. The order in which ingredients combine changes flavor in ways that only become obvious through thousands of tastings. The sauce is never finished. It's always revealing something new. This is the psychological shift that matters most, from how do I get good enough to stop, to how much can I discover about this. The first question creates obligation. You have to practice because you haven't achieved the target yet. The second question creates curiosity. You practice because there's always something else to find. And here's the part that changes everything. Once you're operating from curiosity instead of obligation, repetition isn't a burden anymore. It's a tool. The boring parts, the repetitive drills, the fundamental patterns, the basic frameworks, these become the foundation for discovery rather than the obstacle to mastery. But understanding this psychologically and implementing it practically are different things. Understanding the framework is necessary, but not sufficient. You need to know how to actually build this into your daily work, how to actually redirect your attention, how to actually structure your time so that compression becomes your default instead of expansion. That's what changes the game entirely, because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where the insight becomes a skill, and skills are built through implementation. Everything changes the moment you stop measuring progress by novelty and start measuring it by depth. This is the practical shift. This is where insight becomes action. And it's simpler than you think, but it requires breaking a habit most of us have been building our entire lives. Here's how most people measure their own progress. They count new things, new skills learned, new certifications earned, new projects completed, new roles taken, new knowledge acquired. The metric is expansion, and because novelty produces visible dopamine hits, it feels like progress. Learning something new feels like you're moving forward. Accomplishing something feels like achievement. But elite performers measure differently. They measure depth, they track refinement, they count the layers they've discovered, not the new domains they've entered. They measure how much more they can see in what they thought they already understood. This changes which opportunities you pursue, which projects you commit to, which skills you develop. Most people see depth as a trap. I don't want to be pigeonholed. I need to stay broad. But elite performers see depth as an accelerator. Because here's what they understand. Depth creates optionality. The deeper you go into one domain, the more valuable you become within that domain. And the more valuable you become, the more you can charge for your time, the more selective you can be, the more autonomy you gain. Breadth creates competition. Everyone has a broad skill set. Depth creates scarcity. Very few people are willing to go deep enough to matter. So the first practical shift is this. Change your measurement system. Stop counting new things. Start counting discoveries. Stop asking, what's the next skill? Start asking, what haven't I discovered yet about this one? This alone changes everything about how you structure your time. The second practical shift is more specific, and it's about something called the boredom budget. Elite performers protect time for repetition the way most people protect time for learning something new. They block it on their calendar. They commit to it. They don't treat it as something to squeeze in around their real work. They treat it as the real work. Here's how it works. You identify one skill, one domain, one craft that you want to reach elite level in, not multiple domains. 1. You commit to a boredom budget, a protected block of time every single day or every single week, where you do nothing but refine that one thing. No jumping to something else, no checking email, no context switching, just compression. The boredom budget is typically small at first, 30 minutes, an hour, whatever you can protect. But the key is consistency. It's the same activity, the same time, the same commitment to depth. And here's what makes this work. You're not fighting boredom in these sessions, you're redirecting it. You've already decided that this time is for discovery, not escape. So when boredom emerges, and it will, you don't treat it as a signal to leave. You treat it as a signal that you're about to discover something. A writer I worked with built her boredom budget around one practice, rewriting. She committed to 2 hours every morning rewriting the same passages from a project, not writing new material, rewriting old material, exploring different phrasings, different structures, different approaches. Most writers see rewriting as tedious, a necessary evil, but she reframed it as exploration. Each rewrite revealed something about language she hadn't noticed before, a rhythm in the sentence she hadn't heard, a word choice that created unexpected resonance. The passage was never finished. It was always revealing something. Within a year, her writing had fundamentally transformed, not because she'd learned new techniques, because she'd discovered layers of craft that only become visible through obsessive refinement. A salesperson built his boredom budget around one practice, call recording. He listened to recordings of his own calls, the same approach, over and over. Most salespeople see this as torture, but he used it as a laboratory. What did he miss the first time? What micro-signals was the client sending? Where could his opening question have been more precise? What did his tone communicate without words? After 3 months of this, his close rate shifted noticeably, not because he'd learned new sales techniques, because he'd become so attuned to the micro-signals in conversation that he was making better real-time decisions. This is the implementation. Build a boredom budget. Protect the time. Commit to depth in one domain. Make it sacred. and watch what happens when you stop treating repetition as punishment and start treating it as exploration. But here's the question that pulls everything together. What does this actually look like when it's embedded in your real life? How do you handle the pressure to diversify? How do you explain to others why you're doubling down on depth instead of expanding? How do you stay committed when the culture around you is screaming, "Try something new"? The answer involves understanding how to apply this framework to the specific decisions you're making every single day. Here's where the framework meets reality, because understanding the principle intellectually is different from living it, and living it requires making decisions that most people around you won't understand. The pressure to diversify is relentless. Your manager suggests cross-training. Your peers are learning new skills. LinkedIn is full of people building T-shaped skill sets. The culture everywhere tells you that the safer, smarter move is breadth. And there's logic to this advice. In most contexts, in most careers, versatility does create options. But elite performers have discovered something counterintuitive. The safest move is often the deepest move. Here's why. If you're good at many things, you're competing in a crowded market. If you're exceptional at one thing, you're competing in a market of very few people, and the market pays dramatically differently for rare competence than for common competence. But making this choice requires confidence, because it requires saying no to opportunities. It requires being willing to look narrow for years while you're building depth that most people can't see yet. It requires trusting that depth compounds in ways that breadth doesn't. Most people can't do this. The fear is too real. What if you pick the wrong domain? What if the market doesn't value what you're becoming exceptional at? What if you should have diversified? The uncertainty is paralyzing. Elite performers handle this differently. They don't eliminate the uncertainty. They reframe it. Instead of asking, "What's the safest bet?" they ask, "What domain fascinates me enough that I could spend 10 years exploring it without getting bored?" This is the actual question that determines whether depth will work for you, not the domain itself, your relationship with it. Because if you're building depth in something you don't genuinely care about, boredom isn't a psychological problem, it's a message. It's your brain correctly identifying that you're in the wrong place. But if you're building depth in something that genuinely fascinates you, boredom transforms into curiosity. The same repetition that would feel like torture in one domain becomes exploration in another. A data analyst I worked with faced this decision explicitly. She had multiple opportunities, a leadership role that would broaden her skill set, a specialized analyst role that would deepen her expertise in one domain, or a consulting path that would keep her versatile. The conventional advice was clear: take the leadership role, build breadth, become a well-rounded executive. But she asked a different question. What domain is so interesting to me that I could spend years going deeper without losing engagement? The answer surprised her. It wasn't leadership. It was the data itself. Specifically, statistical inference in complex datasets. Not a sexy career move, not the obvious trajectory. But she took the specialized role anyway, and over 3 years she became so exceptional in her domain that consulting firms started recruiting her. Companies started building entire teams around her insights. She had less breadth than her peers who took leadership roles, but she had so much depth that her market value actually increased faster. This is the decision framework that matters. Don't choose the domain based on external prestige or conventional wisdom. Choose it based on whether it fascinates you enough that repetition becomes exploration. Because that's the only way the framework actually works. But there's another layer to this, and it's about something more psychological than strategic. When you commit to depth, something shifts in how you relate to your own time. Most people see their time as inventory. You have a limited supply, and you need to deploy it across multiple domains. So you're always calculating, Is this the best use of my time? Should I be doing something else? Could I be learning something more valuable? This creates constant low-level stress, the sense that you're never doing quite the right thing. But elite performers see their time differently once they've committed to depth. They see it as exploration time, time in a domain where they're actively discovering, time that isn't being wasted on breadth building or skill switching or opportunity scanning, time that's actually going toward mastery. This sounds like a small shift, but it changes your entire nervous system response. Instead of anxiety about whether you're optimizing correctly, you get focus. Instead of scattered attention, you get compression. Instead of the low-level guilt of, I should be learning something else, you get the satisfaction of, I'm discovering something real. And this changes how you show up to the work itself. A musician described this shift explicitly. She said that before she committed to depth, before she stopped trying to learn multiple instruments and genres, her practice sessions were filled with subtle resentment. She was practicing because she thought she should, because it was the right thing to do. But part of her was always wondering if she should be doing something else. Once she committed fully to one instrument, one genre, that resentment disappeared. Not because the practice became easier, because she was no longer divided. She was fully in the domain. And that wholeness changed everything about her nervous system response to repetition. This is the psychological truth underneath all of this. Elite performers aren't just tolerating repetition differently. They're relating to their own time differently. They're not fighting the domain. They're committing to it. And that commitment creates a completely different experience. But commitment is tested, especially when others don't understand what you're doing, especially when the culture around you is moving in a different direction, especially when the payoff isn't immediate. That's where the real framework emerges, not the framework for building depth, the framework for sustaining commitment when everything around you is telling you to diversify. Here's the part nobody tells you about building depth. The moment you commit, you enter a zone where external validation disappears for a while. Your peers are getting promoted through breadth. You're digging deeper into one thing. They're getting new job titles. You're getting better at the one you have. They're building a resume. You're building a capability that most people can't see yet. This is hard, really hard, because humans are social creatures and we're wired to track status through visible signals. New titles are visible. New skills are visible. New opportunities are visible. Depth is invisible. It's happening internally. You're discovering things that only matter if you go deep enough to see them. Elite performers handle this by building what I call a commitment architecture. It's a set of structures and practices that keep you honest when everything around you is pulling you toward diversification. The first part of this architecture is clarity about what depth actually looks like in your domain. Not vague competence, specific, measurable mastery. What would it mean to be exceptional in this one area? Not world-class, just genuinely exceptional. What would that actually look like? A software engineer might define this as, I can architect systems that scale to 100 million users. A salesperson might define it as, I can close deals that others see as impossible. A writer might define it as, I can make readers feel something they've never felt before. The specificity matters because it gives you a target that's real and measurable. Once you have that target, the second part of the architecture is a tracking system, not a resume, a private record of discoveries. What layers have you uncovered? What micro skills have you developed? What can you do now that you couldn't do last month? This isn't public, it's for you, but it creates evidence that depth is actually happening even when external validation isn't. A data scientist I worked with kept a discoveries journal. Every week, she wrote down one thing she'd learned about her domain that only became visible through deep work. Not obvious things, subtle patterns, weird exceptions, unexpected relationships in the data. 6 months in, she had a document that proved to herself that she was becoming exceptional. The market hadn't recognized it yet. Her title hadn't changed, but the evidence was undeniable. The third part of the architecture is what I call depth signaling. Since external validation is delayed, you need to create internal validation. You need ways to celebrate the progress that only you can see. This sounds abstract, but it's practical. It might look like every month you take on one problem in your domain that seems impossible, not because it's required, because it's interesting, and you solve it. You don't necessarily tell anyone, but you know. And that knowing is validation. Or it might look like you schedule a monthly review where you look at the work you've done and articulate what you've learned. Just for you. But the act of articulation makes progress visible. Or it might look like you find one other person who's also building depth in a similar domain, and you share discoveries with each other. This creates peer validation that matches the depth you're building, not the breadth that social media celebrates. The reason this matters is this: depth takes time. Real mastery takes years, and years is a long time to feel like you're moving sideways while everyone else seems to be moving up. The commitment architecture keeps you sane during that period. It provides evidence that you're actually building something, even when the world isn't reflecting that back to you yet. But here's what actually changes the game. The moment your depth reaches critical mass, everything inverts. Suddenly, the expertise people said you didn't need becomes the thing everyone needs. The narrow focus people said was limiting becomes the thing that makes you invaluable. The boring repetition people questioned becomes the foundation of exceptional capability. This is when you stop competing in the crowded market of generalists and start competing in the rare market of masters, and the money, the opportunities, the autonomy, all of it follows. A consultant I worked with experienced this shift explicitly. For years, she was the person who went deep into one type of problem while her peers rotated through different client types and industries. They were broadening their experience. She was deepening her expertise. Externally, it looked like her peers were moving faster. Then around year 5, something changed. A specific type of problem started showing up in the market more frequently, the exact type she'd spent years mastering. Suddenly, she was the only person who could solve it quickly. She could command premium rates. Clients would wait for her. She had turned her depth into scarcity, and scarcity is where real value lives. But she only got there because she had a commitment architecture that kept her focused for 5 years, while external validation said, this is the wrong strategy. This is where the practical application meets the psychological framework. Because this changes how you make decisions about your time, your energy, your focus. Not just philosophically, concretely. When you're offered a new opportunity, you don't ask, is this a good career move? You ask, does this deepen my mastery or distract from it? When you feel the pull toward learning something new, you don't ask, should I diversify? You ask, can this make me more exceptional at what I'm already building? When you experience boredom with repetition, you don't ask, is this a sign to move on? You ask, what discovery am I about to make? These questions reorganize your entire decision-making, and they work because they're aligned with how elite performers actually think. Not how they say they think, how they actually allocate their time and attention. This is the framework applied. This is the insight becoming action. You now understand something that most people never see. Elite performers aren't superhuman. They aren't born with different brains. They've simply trained themselves to extract novelty from repetition instead of running from it. And once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to measuring your progress by how many new things you're learning. You can't pretend that breadth is the safer strategy when depth is actually where all the leverage lives. The framework is clear. The hidden pattern shows you what's actually happening. Compression beats expansion. Depth beats breadth. The psychology behind it explains why. Your attention can be redirected to find infinite complexity within constraint, and the application tells you exactly how. Build a boredom budget, change your measurement system, commit to depth in one domain, and sustain it through the invisible years when external validation hasn't caught up yet. But understanding the framework intellectually is just the beginning. The real work starts when you implement it, when you make the decision to stop chasing novelty and start exploring depth, when you protect time for repetition the way you protect time for anything important, when you trust that boring is where breakthrough lives. This is the shift that changes everything. Not because repetition becomes fun, it doesn't, but because repetition becomes purposeful. It becomes a tool for discovery. It becomes the only path to the kind of mastery that actually matters. The kind that changes what you can see, what you can do, what you can create. Elite performers didn't discover some secret technique. They discovered something simpler and more powerful. The willingness to go deeper when everyone else is running sideways. The ability to find infinite complexity in apparent simplicity. The courage to build depth in a world obsessed with breadth, and now you know exactly how to do it. The competitive advantage isn't in learning more, it's in understanding more. And understanding only comes from staying long enough to see what others miss.